Hello, and thank you for joining me. My name is Nicole Catalano Miller, and this presentation introduces the Embodied Ecology Framework, a regenerative, somatic, and nature rooted model for health education and collective well being. This framework emerged through the integration of my graduate coursework in health education, developmental theory, program evaluation, systems thinking, somatic and trauma informed practice, and community based wellness programming. The program explores how well being may be strengthened through more relational, embodied, ecological, and participatory approaches to health education and collective flourishing. Many traditional health education approaches have focused primarily on individual behavior change and cognitive learning. While these models offer important contributions to research across public health, developmental science, environmental psychology, trauma studies, and systems theory, increasingly suggest that many contemporary health challenges are not purely individual in nature. Ecological models of health promotion proposed by McLeroy and colleagues emphasize that well being is shaped through interactions among individuals, relationships, communities, organizations, and larger systems. Similarly, the World Health Organization's work on social determinants of health highlights the profound influence of social conditions, access, environment, and inequity on health outcomes. At the same time, developmental and relational researchers, such as Asher and colleagues, emphasize that relationships and context fundamentally shape learning, regulation, and human development. Research on trauma and nervous system regulation from scholars such as Porges, van der Kolk, and Haynes further suggests that stress, safety, emotional regulation, and embodied experience influence how individuals engage, learn, connect, and heal. Environmental psychology and ecological research also increasingly suggest that relationships with nature, green spaces, and ecological systems may influence stress reduction, social cohesion, reflection, and collective well being. The Embodied Ecology Framework emerged in response to these converging areas of inquiry and seeks to integrate embodied awareness, relational connection, ecological belonging, and collective systems thinking into a more holistic and participatory model for health education. At the heart of this framework is the idea that well being is relational, embodied, ecological, contextual, and collectively shaped. Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory proposed that human development occurs within nested systems of relationships and environments, while systems theorists such as Friedrich Capra describe living systems as fundamentally interconnected and relational. Educational philosophers, including Dewey, Freire, Hooks, and Mezirow, similarly emphasize that meaningful learning emerges not only through information transfer, but through experience, participation, reflection, dialogue, and relationship. Research in relational development science increasingly reinforces these ideas by suggesting that trust and belonging, psychological safety, and co-regulation significantly shape learning and well-being. This framework therefore proposes that health does not emerge in isolation. Rather, human flourishing develops through dynamic interactions among bodies, relationships, communities, environments, and broader social systems. Rather than viewing health solely as an outcome of individual choices, this framework proposes that human flourishing emerges through dynamic interactions. This perspective draws from ecological systems theory, developmental science, systems thinking, trauma-informed practice, environmental psychology, and participatory educational philosophy. The Embodied Ecology Framework intentionally draws from these multiple intersecting disciplines because no single field fully explains the complexity of human well-being. Ecological systems theory and public health ecology contribute understanding regarding how development and health are shaped by relationships among individuals, environments, communities, institutions, and systems. And systems thinkers such as Capra further expand this perspective by emphasizing interdependence, relationality, and adaptive living systems. Educational theorists, including Dewey, Freire, Hooks, Mezirow, and Dirks, contribute understanding regarding experiential learning, transformative learning, reflection, dialogue, participation, and meaning making. Relational and developmental scholars like Vygotsky, Bandura, and Osher emphasize that learning and regulation are socially mediated processes shaped through interaction, co-regulation, and shared experience. Somatic and trauma-informed scholarship from researchers such as Porges and van der Kolk and Haynes contribute understanding regarding nervous system states, embodiment, physiological safety, emotional regulation, and relationship between stress and learning. Finally, ecological belonging and environmental psychology research from scholars like Kimmerer, Luca, Clark, and Delshad explore how place attachment, green spaces, reciprocity, ecological stewardship, and relationships with nature may influence well-being and social cohesion. Rather than treating these areas as separate disciplines, this framework attempts to synthesize their overlapping insights into a more integrated and relational model for health education and collective well-being. And while behavior-focused models do provide valuable tools, many approaches still place primary, if not sole, responsibility for health on the individual, while underemphasizing these broader contextual influences. Ecological systems theory and social determinants of health suggest that well-being is profoundly shaped by neighborhoods, by cultures, by institutions, and environmental access, structural inequalities. The Embodied Ecology Framework seeks to expand health education beyond isolated behavioral change, and it does so by integrating relational, ecological, and systems-oriented dimensions of well-being. This framework is organized across 4 interconnected domains of sustainable sovereignty. They include the embodied self, relational belonging, ecological belonging, and collective regenerative systems. The central domain is the embodied self, which includes somatic awareness, emotional regulation, interoception, and embodied learning. The second domain, relational belonging, emphasizes co-regulation, trust, psychological safety, and shared meaning-making. The third domain, ecological belonging, explores relationships with nature, place attachment, sensory engagement, and ecological identity. Finally, the outer domain addresses collective and regenerative systems, including social cohesion, equity, community resilience, participatory systems, and collective well-being. These domains are supported and nourished by critical foundational principles such as trauma-informed practice, systems thinking, cultural responsiveness, participation, and ecological interdependence, equity, among many others. The embodied self-domain focuses on interpersonal awareness, nervous system regulation, emotional processing, and embodied learning. Research in somatic psychology and neuroscience increasingly suggests that emotional regulation, stress response, and physiological states influence attention, learning, participation, and overall well-being. Polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, highlighted the relationship between nervous system states, social engagement, and perceived safety. Similarly, van der Kolk and Haynes emphasize that experiences of stress and trauma are often carried physiologically and relationally, not solely cognitively. This domain, therefore, recognizes that health education is not only informational but embodied. Practices such as grounding, sensory awareness, movement, reflective pauses, breath awareness, and interoceptive noticing may support self-awareness, regulation, reflection, and agency. Importantly, the framework doesn't present somatic practices as universally therapeutic or universally accessible. Experiences of embodiment are shaped by trauma history, culture, identity, facilitation quality, accessibility, and context. Instead, this framework proposes that embodied practices may support learning and well being when implemented thoughtfully, invitationally, and with appropriate trauma informed awareness. The relational belonging domain emphasizes the role of relationships in learning, regulation, development, and well being. Relational developmental theory suggests that humans learn and grow through interaction, dialogue, attunement, and social participation. This domain highlights the importance of trust, psychological safety, empathy, communication, and collaborative meaning making. The framework proposes that supportive relational environments might strengthen engagement, resilience, participation, and well being. Ecological belonging represents one of the framework's primary contributions and explores how relationships with nature, place, and ecological systems may influence identity, regulation, reflection, and collective well being. Environmental psychology research on place attachment, particularly the work of Luica, suggests that emotional bonds with place influence belonging, identity, and social connection. Research on green spaces and community gardens by Clark, Delshad, and others further suggests that ecological environments may support stress reduction, sensory engagement, and social cohesion and community resilience. Robin Wall Kimmerer's work also contributes an important relational and reciprocal perspective by framing humans not as separate from ecological systems, but as participants within interconnected living communities. Within this framework, nature is not viewed merely as a backdrop for wellness programming, but as a relational context that may support reflection, sensory awareness, stewardship, reciprocity, and belonging. At the same time, the framework intentionally avoids romanticizing nature or assuming universal experiences of ecological connection. Relationships with land and environment are shaped by accessibility, geography, culture, trauma, history, environmental justice, and lived experience. The outer domain of the framework focuses on collective and regenerative systems. This domain is grounded in ecological public health, participatory systems thinking, and social determinants of health research, all of which emphasize that sustainable well-being cannot be separated from the broader systems and conditions in which people live. Research on social cohesion, equity, community resilience, and participatory engagement increasingly suggests that collective environments influence both individual and community well-being. Scholars such as Israel and Turin emphasize the importance of participatory and community-based approaches that position communities not as passive recipients of interventions, but as active collaborators and co-creators. This domain therefore emphasizes equity, participation, reciprocity, systems awareness, community resilience, and collective flourishing. The framework proposes that regenerative health education requires attention not only to individual behavior, but also to the relational, institutional, ecological, and social systems that shape opportunities for belonging, participation, safety, and health. The Embodied Ecology Framework is guided by several core principles. These include the understanding that regulation is relational, resourcing is reciprocal, learning is embodied, humans are ecological beings, and participation strengthens agency and belonging. The framework also recognizes that well-being is context-dependent and shaped by broader systems and social conditions. As a result, sustainable and collective flourishing requires attention to equity, accessibility, participation, and ecological interdependence. To illustrate practical application of the framework, this presentation includes an attached example of an intergenerational community green space initiative. The program integrates gardening, place-based learning, somatic and reflective practices, ecological stewardship, and community engagement. Participants engage in collaborative learning experiences that support embodied awareness, relational connection, and ecological belonging, community capacity, and their overall collective well being. The framework proposes that integrated relational and ecological approaches may support outcomes across multiple domains. Potential outcomes include improved emotional regulation, increased self efficacy, stronger social connection, greater place attachment, enhanced ecological stewardship, and strengthened community cohesion. Importantly, these outcomes should be understood as context dependent and influenced by implementation quality, accessibility, culture, and systems conditions. The framework is intended to support future implementation and evaluation. Potential measurable domains include well being, self efficacy, social cohesion, belonging, place attachment, and nature connectedness. Because many aspects of the framework are relational and experiential, mixed methods approaches may be particularly useful. Qualitative methods such as interviews, reflections, and narrative analysis can help capture lived experience and meaning making alongside quantitative measures. It's important to acknowledge the limitations of this framework. The Embodied Ecology Framework is interdisciplinary and emerging rather than universally validated. Experiences of embodiment, nature connection, community participation, and well being are shaped by culture, identity, geography, trauma, history, accessibility, and structural inequalities. The framework should be careful not to romanticize nature or assume universal experiences of ecological belonging. Future research is needed to further operationalize constructs, evaluate implementation across contexts, and explore measurable outcomes. The Embodied Ecology Framework offers one possible direction for more relational, ecological, participatory, and systems-oriented approaches to health education. Potential applications include schools, universities, community wellness programs, public health initiatives, nature-based programming, and trauma-informed educational settings. Ultimately, the framework invites health education to move beyond fragmented and individualistic approaches toward modes that recognize the interconnected nature of bodies, relationships, communities, and ecological systems. The Embodied Ecology Framework proposes an interdisciplinary model for understanding health, education, and collective well-being through embodied, relational, ecological, and systems-oriented perspectives. Rather than positioning health solely as a single individual's responsibility, the framework recognizes that well-being emerges through relationships among bodies, communities, environments, and systems. By integrating somatic awareness, ecological belonging, participatory learning, and collective systems thinking, the framework seeks to support more connected, context-sensitive, and regenerative approaches to health education and collective flourishing. I thank you for taking time with me today to explore this framework, and I wish you continued health and well-being.